welcome. There's that old classic phrase, before you judge someone and say anything negative, walk a mile in their shoes. Makes a lot of sense. Some comedian had a great little addition to that. And that is, before you judge someone and say anything negative about them, walk a mile in their shoes. The advantage there is you'll be a mile away and you'll have their shoes. It's an old classic line. This is a challenging talk. This is on judgment. And there's sometimes kind of a baked-in belief that, well, judgment is not good. Well, judgment is necessary. Last week I talked about how challenging it is to work with judgment towards self. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how you tend to turn the lens of a judgment on others. So I'd like to talk about, in part one, judging versus being judicious. There's a difference, big difference between the two. And the second part, living from unexamined judgment, living your life from a place of not paying attention to how you judge. Part three, the key to wise judgment. And then part four, how the judging mind can be your ally. So hopefully you won't be judging me too much as I go into this talk, and I won't be judging myself as I move into this talk. You know, if you want to get in touch with the nature of the judging mind, it's pretty simple. All you got to do is get into a car and head out onto the highway. You know, on the highway, anyone slower than you is an idiot. Anyone faster than you is a maniac, of course. Everyone and everything in life is an obstruction when you're driving a car, unless you have a breakthrough, like I did, after moving to the Washington, D.C. area and being horrified by my mind as I was driving. I decided to make driving a spiritual practice. Basically, just noticing what's the attitude in my mind right now. And it gets very entertaining. Oh, wow, rage. That's really, really interesting. Huh. What was that, a flicker of sneering derision that just passed through? Or interesting how I just made this young woman who passed me going 95 miles an hour the personification of all human evil on the planet today. You know, in that same way, well, that was it was a transformative practice for me, just to notice how my mind judges everyone and everything, including myself. You can make anything a spiritual practice. You can make work a spiritual practice, make relationship a spiritual practice. In essence, what you do is you amplify self-awareness and loving presence, and then you look at what's really happening. You know, we talk a lot about in meditation the sense of the line. You know, big circle, line through it. Above the line is what you're aware of. Below the line, what you're not aware of. And if you slow down and you start to really pay attention, you begin to notice what's going on below the surface. And for many people, when you start meditating, you begin to notice all these thoughts. And you notice that some thoughts really aren't that helpful. Some thoughts are actually really, really unskillful. And you begin to notice that you develop an ability to evaluate thoughts and determine if they're worthy of support or other thoughts that you might just want to let go and not feed. And naturally, you just notice how your mind judges. There's a distinction between judging and being judicious. By the way, the comedian Dana Carvey had noted a while back that it is impossible to say the word judiciary without sounding intoxicated. So whenever I'm trying to avoid the word judiciary and just stay with judicious, if that's possible. Judging is reacting. It's just reacting out of unconscious bias. Judiciousness is wise discernment. That's when the judge is aligned with a sense of mindfulness, a sense of higher purpose, a sense of loving presence. So, of course, what you begin to notice when you begin to pay attention through this lens of mindfulness or non-judging awareness, you begin to notice what gets in the way of a non-judging mind. There's this word that's often used in meditation of fetters, the things that hold you back from your true nature, from your experience. And we have these 5 mind states that kind of cover up your true nature. That's when the mind is lost in desire and craving and fantasy and planning, or when your mind is lost in aversion or hatred or ill will, when your mind is just consumed with worry and anxiety and restlessness, when your mind is just sucked into sloth and torpor and heaviness, or when your mind is paralyzed by doubt or by self-criticism. Those are strong forces that will keep you from experiencing kind of pure, unadulterated, non-judging awareness. But you could say that there are 3 really big forces that you start to become more aware of in your practice. And you realize that these 3 big forces make it impossible to be present. The first one is greed. Your mind simply wants more at any cost. The second one is hatred. Your mind is filled with blame and anger and ill will. And the third is delusion or confusion, where you're simply confused. You're not really seeing clearly at all. So this practice of mindfulness, of meditation, is so profound. On the one hand, it's really challenging because you realize how pervasive greed, hatred, and delusion are. They're just right there ready to cover or color your experience. And the mind, the judge, comes in so fast, even when you're experiencing moments of peace and clarity. There's a meditation teacher who told the story of doing walking meditation. And in walking meditation, you're just being very absorbed in the sense of your body moving through space. And he found himself just deeply, deeply absorbed and walking slower and slower. And when you do walking meditation on a retreat, everyone is out kind of walking together in different places and different speeds. And he was so deeply absorbed in this kind of ecstatic experience of just feeling the most subtle movement of his body as it moved through space, and simultaneously feeling the soft caress of the breeze. And this thought came through saying, I must look so much cooler than everyone else right now. Normally, when you don't examine what's happening, you just believe your thoughts. And when you don't believe your thoughts, you don't examine your thoughts, then you're off to the races. You're reacting and creating your life based on these unexamined filters of bias. So waking up to internal bias, waking up to the judging mind, and all these internalized filters of life, it's a major force to contend with. It's critical in waking up. Really challenged. But it's not impossible. And that's kind of the good news, is that in the midst of a judging mind, we have the possibility of becoming more awake. Of course, coming in contact with our biases, coming in contact with our instinct to judge can be really painful. And it's just heartbreaking to be more aware of the bias in our culture, the racial bias in our culture now being outed. It's, as someone said, it's not like racism wasn't here. It's just now it's being filmed. We can see it. We see how African Americans are being called out while they're barbecuing and swimming and sitting at Starbucks or golfing or eating at Subway or gardening or trying to get into their own home or cashing a paycheck or bird watching. Enough people were threatened by their very presence that that they called 911. Looking at our unconscious bias on our capacity to judge unconsciously is really our responsibility. A story I ran across, someone wrote this. In 1961, I moved to the United States Virgin Islands, which at that time was populated easily by 85% black residents. It was Saturday morning as I walked down the main street of Charlotte Amalie, and I saw a large crowd of white tourists who had just disembarked from a cruise ship. They had all stopped walking down the street, staring at something behind me. As I reached them, a gentleman asked me what was happening. I turned around and saw a large group of black teenagers leaving our movie theater en masse. I looked at him puzzled and asked, "Well, what do you mean? What's happening?" And he said, "Well, that mob over there." I smiled as kindly as I could, and I said, "It's Saturday morning and those teenagers just left the movie theater." I could see their terror turn to mortification as they realized their reactions and why. When you begin to slow down and pay attention to your mind, you may begin to notice how quickly and how unconsciously your mind reacts and judges. And when you start to pay attention to it, it's a little bit scary or humiliating in a good way. But the judging mind is there to protect you, and that's not a bad thing. The judging mind is just there to scan for danger. Don't eat that. You'll feel terrible after that. Or don't go there. It's not safe. Or it's not worth the risk. I wouldn't do that if I were you. You know, this summer, I ran across a TV show that gave me great hope for humanity. I was feeling really, really poorly, and I guess kind of got caught up in a YouTube thing. I was watching a comedian by the name of Bob Bailey, and he kept mentioning this show called Cash Cab. So I checked it out. If you're not familiar with it, and I certainly wasn't, I don't have a TV, this stand-up comedian, Bob Bailey, drives a cab in New York City. He picks up people and he runs a little game show right there in the cab on their way to their destination. New York City is a pretty diverse place, and kind of seeing blended cultures, asking questions and getting excited and high-fiving over questions and making money. It's just a really cool endorphin hit. And so I binged on a number of these sessions when I wasn't feeling well. And what makes this show all the more heartwarming? It's a very, very simple show. He just picks people up. He announces they're in the cash cab, and many people now in New York, I guess they know this is a thing, so they all kind of recognize it. So usually it's between 10 and 30 blocks, and then he asks some kind of trivia questions, and they make more money as they go along. But along the way, they get something called 2 shout-outs. If they don't know the answer, they get 1 social media shout-out and one street shout-out. Hang with me. The social media shout-out is really cool because they just stop and I don't know if they get on Facebook or if it's live streamed or what, but everyone who's live streaming is rooting for the contestants and throwing out the best answers they can come up with. And so there's just that sense of just support from the universe and a really beautiful sense of well-wishing. But the street shout-out is really amazing because when they don't know the answer and they say, "We want to do a street shout-out," he pulls over and then they just ask someone on the street if they know the question. And here's where you really see a mix of kind of diverse people coming together, trying to solve the problem. It's so good-spirited and so generous. It's just kind of a feel-good. But then at the end, once they arrive, if they get 3 wrong, they get kicked out of the cab. But if they get to the end, they can go double or nothing. So they get double the money if they answer 1 question right, but then nothing if they don't. And here it's so interesting. And again, I saw maybe 10 of these, is you get to see the mind click in. Because then suddenly there's a discussion among the people in the cab. Do we go double or nothing, or do we walk with the money we have? And it's so fascinating to see how some people are kind of cavalier and like, let's just go for it. And others are like, let's stop and just walk with the money that we have. And kind of watching each person's affinity for risk. Kind of it seems like personality type, part of it sort of cultural. But it's just a fascinating thing just to see what people do when they run into a choice point like that. Their bias toward risk suddenly becomes evident for all, and it makes for great TV. When you're caught in unexamined or unconscious bias, what that means is you're locked into a future with limited possibilities. Life is either going to look like one gigantic risk with a downside or one big adventure with an upside. Either I'm quite possibly pathologically positive or just basically delusional. But I like to think, or sometimes I think, like we are maybe starting to wake up to our social biases and to this unconscious capacity of the mind to judge, particularly in light of Black Lives Matter and all that has arisen. The television commentator and writer Van Jones was speaking to a group of fundraisers recently with tears in his eyes. And he said, a black man was lynched and everyone cared. The books on diversity are selling really, really well. There are lots of trainings now in white awareness that are taking off. And I like to think that we're starting to kind of wake up to our cultural biases. Cultivating wise judgment really, I think, comes to one particular key. The key to shifting your mind when it's caught in judgment has something to do in this relational field. Quite a few years ago, I was doing a diversity training, and while I was open to it, I was also a little cynical, like, what's there for me to learn here? And in this group, we were in small groups. And we had to share in our small group a time when we felt excluded and felt made separate. Part of what was eye-opening for me was just recognizing my privilege of just recognizing as a kind of white Anglo-Saxon blue-eyed male, things were kind of bent in my direction, to put it mildly. One person in this group shared how, as a little girl, she admired and loved one of her cousins who was much older than her. Just thought she was the greatest person in the world, her role model. And she was maybe 10 years older than her. And so she was hanging out with her teenage friends, and they were talking about boyfriends and stuff like that. And she was just in the other room kind of listening to the older kids talk. And then her cousin said, thank God I'm not like, and then named this young girl. Thank God my skin isn't so dark like that. And she said for her, that was the first time that she realized that she was being singled out for being different. And it moved her from a place of innocence into a chronic sense of something's wrong with me. And then she began to notice how much bias there was toward her because of the color of her skin. And I really feel that in my training in diversity, that that hearing that story and feeling that story resonate in my heart was maybe the most profound thing out of that entire training. Because what I was feeling was empathy. I could feel what it was like for her as this bright, bright light of a young girl suddenly getting a message from someone she admired that there was something wrong with her. Empathy, your capacity to feel what another person is feeling, is the bridge between judgment. Because a natural element of judgment is blame. And blame is this inevitable capacity to make the other wrong and to close off what's between you and that other person. So I'd like to lead just a short little reflection, if you like. If you like, you can close your eyes and take a few long and slow, deep breaths. And I'll offer just a few questions just for your exploration. The first is to think of someone that you might be judging right now. Or someone perhaps you might be feeling some blame toward this person. And as you feel the breath, take a little bit of time just to kind of go through the files, to reflect on someone that you might like to do a little investigation with here. And you might just take a few moments just to draw this a little bit closer, to kind of draw this relationship in a bit closer. It might be helpful to create a visual representation. Can you imagine this as a kind of a video clip or a single image? In particular, were there any words that were exchanged or anything here in the realm of kind of verbal exchange that you might recall? And finally, you might begin to sense what it feels like on the inside. When you think of this relationship where there's some judging or some blame, can you begin to sense what it feels like on the inside? How does your nervous system hold this? And moving into a little deeper investigation, when you think about the judging or the blame, and when you begin to sense what it feels like on the inside, are there any feeling words that you can come up with? What do you feel as you be with this, as you hang out with this? Are there any emotional words that most resonate? And the shift from judging and blame is to ask yourself the following question. What were you hoping for or wanting here that didn't happen? So here you've taken a little bit of time to sort of recognize where you're judging or blaming, to sense what it feels like inside, to sense the feelings that you're holding here, and to begin to tune into the unmet need, to what you're wanting or hoping for. And if you're open to this, let's take a few more moments and imagine now that you could do a role reversal, that you could kind of slide into this other person's body. Can you imagine what they're feeling? If you could find a sense or imagine what they're actually literally feeling on the inside, where do you imagine they're holding any sense of stress or tension? And are there any emotional words that might resonate with that felt sense? How many different feelings can you imagine they might have right now? And now exploring this question. What do you imagine they were wanting or hoping for that didn't happen? And now, if you would, just take a moment to reflect as you've taken time to sort of reflect on this issue of judgment or blame, the feelings, the unmet need that you're holding. And now when you include the role reversal with the other, imagining what they're feeling or what their unmet needs are, just noting, has anything shifted? Without trying to figure it out or strategize a solution, is there anything that may have shifted inside? And just noticing that. If you like, you can deepen your breath. And if you like, you can open your eyes. I hope that inquiry was helpful, not too traumatizing. But this is the key to empathy. Just the willingness to imagine what another person is feeling. It suddenly moves from a very self-centered place into a more open place. I always love that phrase that the practice here is to see self in other and other in self. It's so easy to say those words. It's so challenging to have the courage to step into that. And so we have little guidelines along the way. I remember at one point being frustrated with my parents and someone saying, well, could you imagine your parents at age 13? And suddenly imagining my parents as kind of like awkward, gawky 13-year-olds just kind of shifted something. It humanized them. It made them a little more real. In imago therapy, in relationship therapy, part of the practice is to think of your partner through the lens of their wounded child. That when you can just remember that a lot of their actions will come from some deep, they're informed by some deep wounded place, it can open up empathy, it can open up possibility, which can be tremendously powerful. James Baldwin wrote this: you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. So it's this quality of heart, the capacity to imagine what another person is feeling, what another person is needing that they're not getting, that can begin to melt this trance of judgment and begin to shift us from judging and open up the possibility of wisdom and judiciousness. I said that without sounding intoxicated. That was good. Here's a classic Dharma story that talks about about wisdom. end judgment. Once when King Pasenadi came to see the Buddha, a group of naked ascetics passed nearby. The king went over, got down on one knee, and offered them homage. When he returned to the Buddha and asked, "Are these ascetics worthy of homage?" The Buddha replied that you could only fairly answer that question after having spent time with them, and only if you were really observant. Well, the king was impressed, and he praised the Buddha, and he said, "Actually, those men are my spies. They're on their way back from having scouted out the enemy, and soon, after bathing and clothing themselves, they'll be back enjoying themselves with their wives." So you can't judge people by their first impressions. The appearance of wisdom is easy to fake. In the past, people were impressed by extreme austerities. At present, the ads for Dharma books and retreats show that we're attracted to the surface criteria, but the principle is the same. The key, first, is empathy. But then the key is also to pay attention and to notice the nature of mind. And here we begin to open up to this quality of discerning mind. You know, it always seems to come down to the paradox. Embrace a sense of openness, but embrace doubt at the same time. Open to the field of infinite possibilities, but at the same time, keep an eye out for the possibility of delusion or confusion. And so, if you open your heart to empathy, it can connect you with another person, but the shadow side is it can also usher in a sense of naivete. If you cultivate a sense of an open mind, the shadow side of an open mind is that you might be spellbound by someone and not really seeing clearly. And so we have this quality of judiciousness, of the wise heart. A quote here: "Just as the royal frontier fortress has a gatekeeper, wise, experienced, intelligent, to keep out those he doesn't know and to let out those he does, for the protection of those within and to ward off those without. In the same way, a disciple of the noble ones is mindful, highly meticulous, remembering and able to call to mind even things that were done and said long ago. With mindfulness as his gatekeeper, the disciple of the noble ones abandons what is unskillful, develops what is skillful, abandons what is blameworthy, develops what is blameless, and looks after himself with purity." So basically, notice when the mind is judging. And this is remarkably simple and remarkably powerful. Someone noticed, this was a teacher who was actually sitting at retreat. Again, during the walking period in meditation, he noticed that he was just caught in kind of unrelenting judgment. And he thought, I'm just going to sit here and just watch and count the judging thoughts as they go by. And so he just sat there, and like people are walking back and forth, and his mind is going like, "Nice pants. Where'd you get those shoes? You know, I'd like a jacket just like that. God, she looks grim." He's not paying attention. And during one walking period, 45 minutes, he noticed about 100 separate judgments. And this becomes really key. Just as your experience of intuition, your experience of aliveness, your experience of the mystery, it only happens when the mind isn't judging, when the mind isn't comparing. So noticing when the mind is comparing and when the mind is judging becomes kind of a second key in addition to empathy. Imagine you're the boss of an organization. Someone who works for you is not doing their job. Do you fire them or do you train them up? Your first reaction may be to judge and get rid of them. But being judicious, it calls on wisdom and compassion. But you're the boss. You have to figure it out. Moving from reaction, calling on wisdom, calling on compassion, on non-judging awareness can allow a higher quality of mind to function, to make the best choices in your life. So it seems like the fuel for a life that feels alive and vibrant and filled with possibility, it seems that it's all arises from cultivating non-judging awareness. When you are experiencing non-judging awareness or mindfulness, then the heart can begin to speak. When you have the presence to pause and listen within, what happens is the line between what you're aware of and what you're not aware of begins to lower, and then you can begin to see all the filters of conditioning that limit your life. There's good news and there's bad news here. The good news is as you begin to cultivate more of a sense of non-judging awareness, the more clearly you can see. The more readily you'll have access to compassion and kindness and joy. The bad news is that you begin to see on more and more subtle levels the filter of greed and the filter of hatred, the filter of delusion. And so the practice remains incredibly rich. And the practice requires that we continue to practice. Sometimes it can feel frustrating because it feels like there's this never-ending dance between noting when you're caught in a judging mind and then having moments of freedom. But I would wager if you have a meditation practice, and if you look back, you may see that over time that there's a greater sense of ease, a greater sense of trust, a greater sense of aliveness in your life. And that's really the measure of a practice. Is your practice resulting in you being more kind? Is your practice resulting in being able to access a place of non-judging awareness where you're seeing clearly, where you have access to your capacity to be awake with a wise heart? Let's take just a few minutes, final, short, yet brief, yet not long meditation. So, taking 3 long and slow deep breaths. Notice where you feel the breath on the inside. And as you feel the breath, you might just, in your own way, notice and acknowledge this quality of mind that is readily there to compare and to judge and figure things out. And you might acknowledge this quality of mind as an ally. To be able to judge and compare can be a tremendous skill. And you might imagine, if just for a few moments, of who you are in the absence of comparing, in the absence of judging. Can you sense, if just for a few moments, this quality of non-judging awareness, of non-judging presence, your capacity to let things be just as they are? And can you sense how healing the judging mind is possible through cultivating empathy. And when you find yourself caught in blame or judgment, and when you begin to imagine what the other person is feeling or needing, how that might begin to soften this hard chasm of judgment. And can you imagine the capacity to be self-aware, to notice when the mind is judging and to gently acknowledge it, and again sense who you are in your capacity to see clearly and to be awake in mind and heart. In these final moments, you might wish yourself well. Imagine your path and your journey filled with a greater sense of ease, imagine your life filled with a greater sense of wisdom and compassion. And if just for a few moments, you might imagine offering that well-wishing out to all beings. May all beings in all directions be filled with a greater sense of ease. May all beings in all directions feel guided by wisdom and compassion. As you're ready now, you can begin to slowly deepen the breath. You can gently open your eyes. Thank you so much for your time and attention. It was great to have this time with you, and may you and your judiciousness have a great time from here on. Thank you so much. Take good care.